So let's start. Today's webinar is on planning guidelines and special requirements for land and housing development. As per BNBC 2020, it is located on part 3. Today is 4th of May 2021, and I am Ziaul Islam, Associate Professor, Department of Architecture, University of Asia Pacific, presenting this webinar. It is a part of capacity building training, UFPS 09. Today's module is P1. So let's move on the topic and the general outline of today's lecture. We will have our topics covered in 3 segments. Segment 1, 2, and 3, each 40-minute segments, and in between we will have 5-minute recesses. The first segment will cover Appendix A, which is planning and development control. Segment 2 will cover guideline for minimum standard housing development, that is Appendix B of Part 3. And segment 3 will cover Appendix C and Appendix E. They are special requirements for cluster planning for housing and building types, development rights, and buildings abutting property lines. So after these segments, at the end of the session, we'll have a question answer time, approximately 15 minutes or a little bit more. During this session, we will look at the 4 appendices of BNBC Part 3. In my 2 previous sessions, I've covered the main chapters, and these are the appendices. Let's go forward and start with the segment 1. This will cover Appendix A, Planning and Development Control. The contents of Appendix A are, there are 6 sections mostly. Section A1 to A6. A1 defines the scope of this appendix. A2 defines land use classification. A3 for general guidelines for residential density planning. A4 general planning guidelines for open space requirements. A5 community open space and amenities, and A6 for plot size. So these are the basic titles of each of the sections, and if we go further detail, we'll see that Section A is a general section discussing the scope, Section A1, but from A2 to A6, the main contents covered quite a lot of materials. A2, the land use classification, involves permitted land use, conditionally permitted land use, restricted land use, 3 types of land uses, and at the same time it discusses on preservation of open space and water bodies. In A3, the main content is integrated planning, hierarchy of residential densities, capacity of infrastructure and environment, public transport and density distribution, environment and heritage protection. So the section A3 will deal with these contents. These are just basic guidelines so that we can relate later on when we'll go to further details. A4 discusses on open space preservation, maintaining environmental balance, hierarchy and network of open spaces, active and passive recreation. A5 discusses on community open space for buildings within a plot and community open space for area planning. And finally, A6 deals with plot sizes, So minimum plot size for different occupancies will be one of the topic. The other one will be the minimum frontage for different occupancies. On the right hand column, as usual, as we have presented in our previous presentations, webinars, there are some cross-referencing between chapters of BNBC. So this appendix is not independent. It is connected to other chapters and other parts of BNBC. So this is basically the reference chapters and parts. One unique changes we can notice here that A2, the land use classification, refers to a policy or master planning which is outside BNBC. Actually, it refers to the National Land Use Policy and local or regional master planning. The same thing is applicable for A3 as well. They refer certain issues which may not be within the BNBC 2020, but outside the BNBC. But this is a standard procedure, and BNBC works along with other laws of the land and other policies of the land, and they are all in compliance, and it is an integrated component of a larger scenario. So we have a land use policy in our country, and there are different regional and local master planning done by different authorities, government agencies. So the first two sections refer to those references, and we'll go to detail to understand how they refer. So let's go for the discussion of each of the sections in detail. So this is the part 3, Appendix A of BNBC 2020. We will be discussing planning and development control. So the scope at the very beginning defines that there should have been a planning and zoning code. Since it is not there, absence of the planning and zoning code in national level, this appendix states certain planning guidelines for development control and for environment and human safety. The guidelines formulated in this appendix are suggestive. So this is the building code, not a planning code. And if there had been a planning code here, probably this part was would have been covered by the planning code. In absence of that, the BNBC suggests certain guidelines here. So now about the land use classification. There are a few statements that are very important for a country like Bangladesh. We have it's quite a populous country and a limited resource. So land is one of the resources, and at the very beginning we declared that this is a finite resource. So an integrated and hierarchical planning from national to local level of this resource is essential to identify and use its potential in compliance with the national land use policy. So this is a primary goal that we have to use this resource judicially and judiciously, and it has to be a very integrated and hierarchical planning, and it has to comply with the national land use policy. So every city, township, municipality and other settlements shall have planning and zoning regulations administered by the authority having jurisdiction to guide the existing and future developments in compliance with national land use policy or with local and regional master planning. So this is the guideline for the local authorities who have jurisdiction for planning, and they will create a planning and zoning regulation and which will guide the development present and future. They must comply with the national land use policy and other master planning criteria. But all these land use planning shall clearly classify the following uses. So there are three types of uses which are required to be mentioned in the planning guidelines. One is permitted land use, the second one is conditionally permitted land use, and the third one is restricted land use. But that's not all. Any such plan shall also include the preservation of open space and water bodies. So this is an additional criteria that must be met in any land use planning. So this is the basic part of land use classification. Then we go for the general guidelines for residential density planning. Residential density planning is a fundamental component of effective land use because the relative distribution of population has major implication for all other provisions. So in determining residential density, a coherent view should be considered to achieve integrated land use, transport, environmental and infrastructure planning. So there must be an integrated approach which will create a balance between transport, environment, infrastructure planning, and density, residential densities. Along with this integrated approach, the following factors shall also guide the residential density. A hierarchy of residential densities should be maintained to ensure diversity of housing needs. I have highlighted few words just to focus our points actually, that we need diversity of housing needs, and to make that, to ensure that, we need to distribute residential densities in hierarchies. So these two factors have been highlighted here. Likewise, B, residential density of an area shall correspond to the capacity of existing and planned infrastructure and environmental features. So there are two issues. One is planned infrastructure, existing and planned infrastructure, and the environmental features of a locality. So residential density shall correspond to that. C, excuse me. Densities should be planned in such a way that encourages public transport and reduce travel demands. These are basic guidelines for all residential densities. For large cities, higher densities around station and interchanges of rail-based public transport system may be encouraged to reduce reliance on road-based public transport system. Since higher density residential development near high capacity transport system creates pressure on urban land use planning, careful environmental planning with definitive environmental objectives shall be there for such instances. To protect environmentally sensitive areas and areas of historical importance, a low density residential development should be proposed where and as necessary. So there is an indication of density distribution where the higher densities will be and where the lower densities will be. In heavily built up areas such as old towns, provisions of transfer of development rights (TDR) could be implemented to control overcrowding. So these are the general guidelines for distributing residential densities, and there is just another guideline for it. The maximum allowable density of a residential development shall be guided by the planning guidelines for a zone or area or locality or township, which shall be prepared under the prepared under and administered by the authority having jurisdiction. So actually it is the authority having jurisdiction who will decide that what will be the maximum allowable density for a locality or for a zone or area or township. Floor area ratio, FAR, for any development shall comply with any such planning guidelines. Where such density guidelines are not available, maximum allowable density for a residential development shall be 175 units per hectare. So there is a baseline. If we don't have any other guideline present for referring to that development, we will consider this density guideline as a reference for our development. So as we all know that these are the density distribution guideline for residential densities. Now comes the open space guidelines, general guidelines for planning open spaces. So I think the whole para makes sense. So I'll go line by line for this part at least. In a high density context like ours, pressure on land is extreme. Preserving open spaces and maintaining environmental balances become a priority in this context. In any planning process, open space must be planned as a land use in its own right. So although apparently open space is not a kind of dedicated defined land use, but here it is stated that open space must be planned as a land use. And not as the remainder after providing the other land uses. So it has to be a focus of the planner while planning the settlement or an area or a master plan. The hierarchy of recreational open spaces in planning settlements may be as following. So there are three types of open spaces. One is local open space, then ward open space, and then regional open space. Authorities having jurisdiction shall determine the extent of the term local, ward, and region. So these are a bit flexible. Authority will define that which area should be known as local or designated as local and ward and region, but it is not totally free. They will do it on the basis of governance structure and the master planning for any particular area. So there are references on the basis of which they will define the extent of a locality or a ward and region. So all open spaces in this hierarchy should act as a connected component of an open space network. So they are not independent and disconnected, disjointed. They must be planned in a way so that they are also a part of an open space network. That is another guideline for open space requirements. So let's go into detail for each of the open spaces. For local open space, every locality should have local open space. which is required to meet primarily the passive recreational needs like outdoor sitting, jogging, walking tracks, playgrounds for children, etc. These are all passive recreational needs of the population. Such spaces should be located either within the residential neighborhood or somewhere centrally to serve a wider area of more than one neighborhood. So as we can understand that they are relatively smaller in scale, located within the locality, and there are few guidelines about the space requirements here. Considering the projected future population of a locality, we must notice that it is the projected future population, not the existing population. So of the locality, a minimum requirement of 1 square meter of local open space per locality occupant should be allotted. So this is the basic guideline for a new development. This has to be followed, but where it is already a built-up situation, if possible, such open spaces should be at least 500 square meters. So even in the newer communities, in the newer localities, it can be a parcel of 500 square meter, multiple parcels of 500 square meters. So it is suggested that it should be at least 500 square meter or more. So what is ward open space? Every ward in a city or town or union should have ward open space, which is required to meet the active recreational needs, that is standard facilities for sports, and also passive recreational needs for the ward population. So it is in hierarchy, it is a bit larger space for the whole ward, and the space requirement is similar. It is 1 square meter ward open space per ward occupant, and the minimum size here is 10,000 square meter or 1 hectare is the minimum size for ward open space. And for the regional open space, every region should have regional open space, which is required to meet wider recreational needs of the population that cannot be served by local or ward open spaces. In metropolitan areas, ward open spaces may supplement for 50% of the regional open space requirement. So it is a flexibility and exception that in metropolitan areas, ward open space and regional open space may overlap. They can supplement each other. Conscious planning efforts are needed to create, designate, and preserve regional open spaces located close to major public transport routes. So this is a consideration so that majority of the population can have a good access to regional open spaces, but these spaces should be taking advantage of natural landscape, waterfront, hill view, forest areas, and or views to special features that may draw visitors from all around. So they are also serving our recreational purposes, but of a different kind, not served by the local open space or ward open space. Where possible, such open spaces should be at least 50,000 square meter, 5 hectare. This is the minimum size. Of course, it can be much larger. So these are the 3 types of open spaces which should be placed in a hierarchy for a larger planning scenario. Now comes the open space criteria within a plot. It is community open space and amenities. So every plot as specified in section A5.1 and A5.2 shall have community open spaces which is required to meet primarily the passive recreational needs, outdoor sitting, jogging, walking tracks, playgrounds for children of the population. Such spaces shall be located within the plot boundary. So this is about each individual plot development. Considering the types of development, the following minimum requirements of community open space and amenities shall be applicable as per guidelines of these sections. So let's go through the sections. A.5.1, community open space or community space for a single tall building or group of buildings in a plot. For all residential or residential cum business buildings having 10 or more stories, or for all plots on which more than one residential or residential cum business buildings are constructed, community built space at the rate of 5% of the total floor area shall be provided within the building for use of the occupants of the building solely. Roofs of such buildings shall not be considered as community open space. So this is mostly focusing on a plot and tall building or relatively higher density development or mixed use development. So that is the guideline for the community open space for such developments. For residential or residential cum business plots measuring more than 0.1 hectare. So there is a size mentioned. These are relatively larger plots. So 0.1 hectare, it has to be more than 0.1 hectare. 10% of the area of land or 1 square meter per occupant of the plot, whichever is larger, shall be left vacant to the use as a children's playground. This playground shall be contiguous and shall have a length not exceeding 2.5 times of its width. The playground may extend into the mandatory open space of the lot. So relatively larger plots will have a different guideline for community open space, and that is guided by two criteria. One is 10% of the area of the land or 1 square meter per occupant, whichever is larger will be needed for community open space. And this particular open space can overlap with the mandatory open space or setback areas. Open space and amenities for residential cum business plots measuring more than 0.4 hectares. So this is about much larger plots. This was more than 0.1 hectare, but less than 0.4 hectare, it is implied. So where the plot size is much larger, shall be as per guideline of section A.5.2. So this is the next section that guides what will happen to plots that is more than 0.4 hectare. So residential or business areas, in dividing any land measuring a total of 0.4 hectares or more into residential or business plots, community open spaces and amenities shall be reserved for recreational, educational, healthcare and other purposes depending on the size of the population for which the layout is planned. For planning such open spaces and amenities, there are guidelines that has to be followed. So, and for industrial areas, it is said that 5% of the total land shall be reserved as amenity open space. The minimum size of such open spaces shall be 600 square meter. Where the area of the open space exceeds 1000 square meter, the area of the land in excess of 1000 square meter can be used for the construction of building for banks, clinics, welfare centers, and other common facilities. So there are two separate guidelines for larger plots, and one is for residential and business situation, and the other is for industrial situation. So that ends the planning part. Now we are going to individual Plot size. So plot divisions and plot sizes are part of integrated planning decision and shall be determined by the area development authority having jurisdiction where no such guidelines exist or yet to be undertaken. The following criteria mentioned in section A61 and A68 regarding plot sizes shall be applicable. So about the residential plots, can relate. Something is wrong with this color. Okay, it's here now. So A1 relates to 66 square meter, A2 133 square meter, and A3 is 200 square meter. This is the minimum size of the plot respectively. And they also have to have some road frontage. Can you see the presentation? I think that there is some glitches here. Okay, I'll just stop the screen share for a moment and we'll come back quickly. Well, I think it should be okay by now. So this is yeah. So these are the three occupancy type and their respective plot areas, which are to be abide by. And for road frontages, we have to consult table 3.A.1. It is provided there for different plot sizes. We'll go through it. It is just below. So there are a few additional criterias. These are that plots accessible by link roads shall be considered to have a frontage equal to the width of the link road. Plots of irregular shape abutting the road shall be considered to have a frontage equal to their average width parallel to the road. Okay. The other criteria are like that limitations of plot sizes and frontages imposed in A6.1 above may be waived for the approved affordable housing, including site and service scheme. So this is a exemption for approved affordable housing and site and service scheme. The limitation of plot size and frontages may be waived, but there are other guidelines that will decide that how much waiver they will get, and that is given to Appendix B. The minimum size of the plot for a group housing development scheme and other special requirements for group housing developments shall be as specified or approved by the respective city development authority. So the final guideline for plot size is that for minimum standard housing, government may allow smaller plots following the guidelines mentioned in Appendix B. So Appendix B has certain suggestions about much smaller plot size than mentioned here. This is the that is a flexibility made for minimum standard transitional housing or minimum standard housing somewhere in Appendix B. We will go through that in the next phase of our presentation. So let's look at the table right now. It says about the minimum frontage of residential plot. So there are three types of residential development: approved row type, semi-detached type, and detached type. There are plot sizes defined for that. Minimum plot size should be 66 square meter, and this particular typology is approved up to 133 square meter, and the required road frontages are 4.5 meter and 8 meter. So this is the basic structure, and it is given to other typologies as well. We are not going into detail, just we should look at the footnote. Here is a flexibility. As you can see that for semi-detached house there is a minimum size. For approved row house there is a minimum size. But for detached house it is not mentioned whether it is a minimum size or not. So there is a note about it here. That for plot size larger than 133 square meter, detached housing type may be allowed provided that the site frontage is 12 meter or more. So if the site frontage is 12 meter or more, detached housing type may be allowed for even 133 square meter or more plots, larger than 133 square meter plots. So that was applicable for residential buildings. Now plots for educational buildings. Minimum size of the plot for educational buildings will be based on occupant's capacity and shall be at the rate of 4 square meter per pupil or occupant. The minimum plot size shall be 3,950 square meter. Further elaboration is given on Appendix B. Plot for assembly halls, theatre and cinemas. Minimum size of plot for assembly halls, theatre, cinema halls and other similar buildings where people will gather for entertainment or public functions shall be based on the seating capacity of the building and shall be at the rate of 3 square meter per seat. So there is a table below, table 3.8.2, that gives some more elaboration on this topic. This is the table where the subcategories of occupancy I is given. There were 5 subcategories: large assembly, small assembly, large assembly without fixed seats, small assembly without fixed seats, sports facilities, and the basic standard is 3 square meter per seat. So but for sports facilities it is there are 2 components here. One is related to the event, that is the sports field or area dedicated for sports, and the spectator capacity. Spectator capacity will be determined by 3 square meter per seat again. So that is the plot size for sports facilities, for assemblies. For community centers in rural or urban areas, the minimum size of the plot will be 1300 square meter. For business and mercantile plots, the minimum size will be 200 square meter with a road frontage of not less than 10 meters. So 2 criteria are applicable for business and mercantile plots. One is the road frontage, that should not be less than 10 meter, and the minimum size of the plot will be 200 square meter. For industrial plots, the minimum size of the industrial plots shall be 300 square meter. Road frontage shall not be less than 15 meter. So it needs a higher road frontage, and the minimum size will be 300 square meter. Petrol and filling stations, the minimum size of the plot will be 500 square meter, and the road frontage shall not be less than 30 meters. The minimum size of the plot for petrol station with service bay but without repair workshop shall be 1100 square meter, and the road frontage width shall not be less than 30 meters. So there are 2 options. One is with service bay but without repair workshop, and the other is without service bay and repair workshop. So there are two provisions for that. And plot for other uses, the minimum size of the plots for buildings, for recommendation for business and mercantile plots, that it will be at least 200 square meter, and the road width will, the road frontage will not be less than 10 meter. As for industrial plots, it will be 300 square meter minimum plot size, and the road frontage will not be less than 15 meter. For petrol and filling stations, there are two provisions we already have discussed on that. And for other uses, plots for other uses, the minimum size of the plot for those mentioned in section 8.6.1 to 8.6.7 shall be determined by the authority having jurisdiction. So there is no specific guideline for this particular other uses. The authority will decide the guideline. So this is the end of our segment 1, and I think we can take a very small recess. Actually, we have already wasted few minutes, so maybe I'll be back within 3 minutes. Thank you. I hope we're all back. So let's start with the second part of our webinar, which is segment 2, containing the guidelines for minimum standard housing development, Appendix B. The sections covered here are B1, general information, B2, types of development, B3 is on planning principles, B4, general building requirements. In detail, actually, the main content of B1 will be defining the minimum standard housing, and its two typologies. One is standard community, minimum standard community housing, and the other one is minimum standard transitional housing. And then it will discuss on requirements of community facilities and dwelling classifications. So that is the kind of orientation that will be given by the general part. There is one aspect to notice here, that column 2 and column 3 has two highlighted components. One is minimum standard transitional housing, and in column 3 there is government bodies and public agencies only. So it is to refer that this particular typology of housing can be carried out by the government bodies and public agencies only, not for private agencies or private development. But the others are for both public and private development. Then the section B2 that deals with type of development, it discusses with 5 types of development. One is single unit plots of row type housing, multi-story flats of row type housing, block development as a group development, group housing, cluster housing, and site and service scheme. So that is types of those are the types of development. The third section deals with the planning issues of this minimum standard housing. So it first of all, it gives us an idea what type of planning it will be. It is a comprehensive and integrated planning. Then comes the density issue, and there will be basic requirements for community facilities and facilities for localities. The size of the plot will be discussed here. As you can remember that in Appendix A, we were referred to Appendix B for special provisions of size of the plots for minimum standard housing. So that will be given here. And then comes the internal roads and walkways. So that will be the planning guidelines. And finally, there will be general building requirements. So it is about building where the plinth coverage, height limitation, plinth level, habitable room, kitchen, bathroom, and water closet, balcony, corridor, stairs, water supply, lighting, and ventilation will be discussed. And they will time to time refer to part 3, chapter 1, and there will be some tables here that has to be consulted for further details. So we'll go to the details then. This is the Appendix B, dealing with the guidelines of minimum standard housing development. So the general discussion says that the government bodies and public agencies may designate an area in the master plan for the development of mass housing project. Generally, all such developments shall be known as minimum standard housing. There will be two categories of it. One is minimum standard community housing. The other one is minimum standard transitional housing. And there will be special provisions for them regarding the requirement for master plan and dwelling units. So for a minimum standard community housing, it shall conform to the basic minimum requirements regarding dwelling units, community, and other facilities. So there will be some basic minimum requirements, and it will conform to both about dwelling units and community and other facilities. Requirements for community facilities in this housing shall depend upon the size and scale of the community, and about the dwelling units in all such developments, they shall be classified as occupancy A1, A2, A3 or mixed occupancies depending upon the type of development and degree of mixing with other occupancies within the same structure. So this is the minimum standard community housing. The minimum standard transitional housings are housing facilities on a transient basis. This is important that they are not permanent housing. So these are housing on transient basis and before providing its inhabitants with minimum standard community housing. So they will be given minimum standard community housing, but before that it is a kind of transitional phase which will be done here, done by the transitional housing. What is the objective of this particular housing? The primary obligation of this transitional housing will be to ensure safety, health, and sanitation. So these are the primary obligation of a transitional housing. They must be met here. Since it may not be convenient or practicable for the planning and dwelling units in such projects to be in full compliance with all requirements of a code, a few exemptions have been made for all such housings in the following sections of Appendix. All transitional housings, irrespective of its type of development, shall be group housing. So these are not independent houses. These are all part of a group housing that must be considered as a group housing, all transitional housings. So only government bodies and public agencies should be responsible for planning these settlements following the density guidelines of Appendix A. The guidelines and requirements regarding design and construction of buildings for minimum standard housing, it is in general for both type in approved layout are applicable to all government bodies, public agencies, private developers, and individual owners. So whoever develops this sort of housings the rules and guidelines and requirements given here will be applicable for all without exception. So what are these housing typologies? The typologies for minimum standard housing are as follows, that it can be single unit plots of row type housing, multi-storied flats of row type housing, block development of as a group housing, cluster housing, and site and service scheme. The guidelines for planning and general building requirements shall be applicable to all types of development of minimum standard housing unless exempted as mentioned in this appendix. So there are few exemptions somewhere, but otherwise the basic guidelines will remain same for all the housings. So now the elaboration of each type. Single unit plots of row type housing. Row type housing is a housing development. In a housing development is characterized by independent plotted development. So this is independent development, plot based, for single family dwelling A1 and shared community facilities. So it is a plotted development for single family and who shares their community facilities, along with single family detached and single family and semi-detached dwelling. This type of dwelling is used to achieve low densities in a settlement. So there is a suggestion about the density as well, that these are the low density development tools for housing. This single unit plots or row type housing. This type of development should be located away from high capacity public transportation system and should be characterized by high car ownership rate. As it is a relatively low density development, there is a locational suggestion that it should be located away from high capacity public transportation system and will better be served by high car ownership, so that people will have individual mobility. And of course there will be other public transportation system, but not high capacity public transportation systems. So all such developments shall comply with the provisions for party wall, a new term for us. We will go through it in the later phase. The party wall will be discussed in further elaboration, and general criteria for natural lighting and ventilation. Since it is dealing with shared wall situation, so which is called party wall, so there will be additional care for party walls and for ensuring natural lighting and ventilation as described in this code. So there are few references, that part 3 chapter 1, part 6, appendix E. So they all deal with the construction and natural lighting and ventilation. Those guidelines will be complied by. So this is the general outline for row type development. There are three area, mainly built area. The white area is open spaces and the hatch area is for parking situations. So there might be many possible alternatives for this typology. This is just a suggestive outline. For multi-storied flats of row house typing, but they are not plotted development like the previous one. Here the undemarcated, undivided land is shared by the flat owners within the complex. So this is a different type of development, another row type development, but multi-storied, and it is on a shared, undivided, undemarcated land. Houses or flats or apartments in multi-storied row type development shall share walls with adjacent flat or apartment, provided that they are designed and built at the same period as part of the same project, and also that they fulfill the general criteria of natural lighting and ventilation. Multi-storied row type development should be permitted for walk-up apartments, A3, as well as two-family dwellings, A2, with many of the community facilities at lower levels. Such developments are good for medium density. So the first one was good for lower density. This will have a little bit of more densities, medium density. Block development as a group housing. Block developments are characterized by high density, large scale development. So at the very beginning, it deals with the high density within a block. Usually surrounded by roads all around and serviced by high capacity transport and utility network. So since it will have high density, it has to be located in a position, in a location where high capacity utility network and transport networks are there. Large plots of 4048 square meter or more with road access on one side may also be considered as block development if provided with a peripheral access road along the perimeter, and also if they are in close proximity to high capacity transport and utility infrastructure network. All such plots may be allowed to attain higher densities than other typologies. Such developments are more desirable in the central urban areas, emphasizing more dependency on public transportation and less on private transportation. Parking requirements in such typologies shall be less than other typologies. So it is just the opposite of the row type development. It will depend more on public transportation, and it will have less private transportation or individual mobility, more of a mass mobility or collective mobility. Block development for group housing should be permitted for large scale developments of apartment A3 and mess and boarding house, dormitories and hostels A4. So two typologies are allotted here. Residential developments, all such residential developments can be mixed with other permitted occupancies. So a mixed use is suggested here to encourage availability of all services within the closer proximity and also to support growth of local economy. So there are two objectives for using this mixed pattern. All such developments can be subdivided into following two categories. So there are two categories. One is tower block development for group housing, and another is perimeter block development for group housing. As it is evident from the titles, the tower block, it includes the flats or apartments A3 in a single or multiple high-rise towers within a block, or large site with relatively low ground coverage and higher density, along with open spaces and community facilities within and around the tower blocks. So what is perimeter block development? Unlike tower blocks, perimeter block developments involves one single building or multiple buildings placed along the perimeter of the site to create an internal open space shielded from the surrounding, commonly used as a community space. Each housing unit in such developments shall have at least two sides open, one at the internal open space, the other at the external road side. Depending upon the plot size and population, such development may also be permitted to become high-rise developments, provided that the internal open space conforms to the minimum requirements of a courtyard. So there are guidelines for courtyard in part 3 chapter 1. If it conforms to that, it can become taller, this typology. So this is the block development. Now comes the cluster type. The cluster type development is very much suitable for accommodating low to high density of population within workup range. Cluster type development for group housing should be permitted for all ranges. So A1, A2, A3, A4, for all ranges they will be permitted. Details of this typology has been discussed in Appendix D. So there will be another appendix for detailing out the cluster housing. We'll go there and we'll have more detailed understanding of cluster housing there later on. So finally, the site and service schemes. Site and service schemes shall delineate individual plots and provide for the infrastructural needs for the development of permanent housing. Interim constructions by the allottees should also be permitted. Skeletal structures for a roof on column or development or developed plinths may be provided if funds are available. So this is the general description of a site and service scheme. Sanitation and water supply must be provided. So this is a priority. The sanitation and water supply infrastructure is a must for site and service scheme, even prior to the building components. A sanitary service core or common water supply and sanitation facilities for planned groups of plots should normally suffice. The developing agency shall install the service before handing over the plots. So that is a condition that must be met, that the owner will receive the services, the plots with the services. Site and service scheme for group housing should be permitted for low density development of single family housing and two family housing, and ownership right of such housing shall be non-transferable. So there is a extra criteria for ownership here. These are the diagrams for different types of developments, that is for perimeter block development, units placed along the perimeter, creating a central open space, units having two sides open and the other side shared. One is the internal side and the external side. Cluster type development will be organized in clusters with different spaces in between. So that is the cluster type development. So now comes the planning part. A minimum standard housing shall ensure quality living. Actually, the main target is to make a comprehensive planning, and this comprehensive planning must ensure the environmental quality, social and utility infrastructure, educational facilities, healthcare, recreational facilities, connectivity to commerce, and job locations. It has to be a very comprehensive planning for such minimum standard housing. About the density, housing density shall be decided by the authority for such developments in accordance to the detailed area plan, if they have one. Where such guidelines are unavailable, gross density of a minimum standard housing will not be more than 175 units per hectare. So if the detailed area plan suggests something else, it will be followed through, but if there is no such guidelines, it will be 175 units per hectare, considering an average population of 5 persons per dwelling units. And a general distribution of built area and open space guidelines are given in section B33. This is section B33. Basic requirements for community facilities and facilities for locality. Any minimum standard housing, irrespective of its type of development, should be planned and organized in group of clusters, where each of the clusters should not exceed 400 units. So there is a limit if it is the a 400 dwelling units maximum in a group or cluster uh, uh, with the same population per unit, five persons per unit, where the number of dwelling is more than that, more than one clusters, each below 400 units should be formed. So if it exceeds 400 units, there will be multiple clusters. In any housing project, community and community and facilities for locality are essential. So the facilities required for any such projects shall depend on the size of the community or community within a locality. There are two tables here that outlines such facilities. Before continuing further, we are just having a glimpse of these tables. There is table 3.b.1 which deals with the minimum width of community open space, and 3.b.2 that deals with the threshold population and minimum reference standard for facilities for community and locality. So we'll go through it further, but let us come back to a few other points first. So open space within a site area. Open spaces within a site area shall be defined in section 1. Shall be as defined in section 1.8 of part 3 chapter 1. We have already gone through it, and so there is a definition in part 3 about the open space within a site, and we'll follow that here as well. For minimum standard housing, such open spaces shall also be equal or more than the open to sky space, which is an outcome of addition of two components. One is mandatory setback area and the area requirement of community open space, COS, as per B.3.3.2. For plots below 4048 square meter, community open spaces may overlap with mandatory setback. So although there are two components and the addition of them will be recognized as community required open space, but for smaller plots than 4048 square meter, they can overlap. So there is a flexibility. Community open space shall not be less than 1 square meter per occupant. So there is a general reference of 1 square meter per occupant for most of the open spaces. We can see community space is also part of it. So community facilities consists of two components. One is community open space and the other is community built space. So community open space is an undivided contiguous space within a plot or block or cluster, which along with mandatory setback mandatory setback area constitutes the open space of the site. Depending upon the size and population and land area, this space may be used as any or combination of the following: lawn, garden, play lot. All such uses shall be exclusive to the residents of the plot or block or cluster. So this is not a open public space for everyone. It is dedicated to the residents of that particular development. No paved area other than the minimum required area for vehicular and pedestrian access to the site is allowed within the community open space. All such roads and walkways shall ensure pedestrian priority and shall not be used as through circulation. The following guidelines shall be maintained if the area of the community open space within the site fulfills the criteria mentioned the first column of table 3.b.1. So it refers to the table again, and we'll go through it very shortly. Community built space is part of the community facilities dedicated to serve the population within a given site or block or cluster. Depending upon the threshold population, the CBS shall include facilities as per guideline of table 3.b.2 for a threshold population up to 200 families. So now we should go to the tables. The first table is about guideline of minimum width of community open space for open space area of 130 square meter or more, but below 700, and for 700 or more. The minimum width will be 9 meter and 21 meter respectively, and in a manner so that these particular sports events can happen there. The dimension should conform to that. Facilities for locality. There is another facility for the larger mass of population. Facilities for localities are shared facilities consisting of both local open space and local built space. So local open space, we have already seen that there are local open spaces, but a new idea of local built space is also here. Located outside the plot boundary, but within the locality. The community, a total space requirement of the facilities for locality shall vary considerably depending upon the requirement of the net density, gross density, and threshold population of table 3.b.2. So let's go to the table now. Table 3.b.2, there are 4 components. One is the facility, the other is the threshold population to start the facility, and the third one is minimum standard, referred standard, and the fourth is level served. And it has some broad headings like general. There are a few general components. There are a few educational components, some commercial components, some socio-cultural components, healthcare components, and service and utilities components. There are more actually, sports and recreational components. So these are the components, and there are other subcomponents under it. And we can see that there are few asterisks used here and there in this reference. So let's go through it first, what these asterisks refer to. A single asterisk refers to all general facilities shall be accommodated within the plot, block, or cluster area. For any housing having a population of 10 families or above, such facility shall not be less than 1 square meter per person. So asterisk 1 implies to general facilities and a particular population size. 2 asterisks, all such facilities must be part of integrated planning, prioritizing close proximity to the housing units they serve. The distance of such facilities from the serving units should not be more than 0.4 kilometers. So there are few facilities, those has to be located in a manner so that it doesn't exceed this particular distance range and connected to the housing units they serve. All such connecting pathways, streets, etc. shall be away from the major roads and shall have pedestrian priority. So there is a planning guideline as well. And for 3 asterisks, there are some outlines. Public transport stoppages should be located nearer to health facilities, post-secondary educational institutions, and other public buildings, and should be supported by public parking facilities nearby. So components containing 3 asterisks will be located near near health facilities, post-secondary educational institutions, and other public buildings, and should be supported by public parking facilities. So this is the basic guideline. We'll go through a few of the components just to have an idea that, say, for example, the community open space, the standard is it has to start when it is above 2 families. So if there are 3 families living in a same area or plot or development, it has to be 1 square meter per person of community open space left within the plot. So that is what it implies here. For educational facilities, a daycare center, it has 2 asterisks. So it has to be pedestrian priority, away from public transportation route, and there are some other clause as well. So the starting threshold population is 100 to 300 families, that is 500 to 1500 persons. Minimum 6 children will be the required facility, and it can be given at plot level or local level. For nursery kindergartens, there are other standards, but it is at local level, and there are few facilities which are at ward level or at regional levels. So that is the basic outline of this table, and I think there are lots of information in between, and we don't have much time to go through it, so I'll skip it here. Let's go to the next topic, size of the plot. For minimum standard community housing, the guidelines of plot size mentioned in Appendix A will be followed by minimum standard transitional housing. All types of minimum transitional housings except site and service type shall be group housing and shall abide by the plot size requirement of Appendix A. Site and service scheme for single room development. So there are 2 options for site and service scheme. For site and service transitional housing development, where these are actually exemption from the previous rule, exceptions. Site and service transitional housing, where a minimum standard house with a single room, kitchen, bathing facility, and water closet. So it is a very small house with kitchen and bathing facilities adjoined with a single room, are expected to develop. The minimum plot size may be reduced to 30 square meter within a minimum with a minimum frontage of 4.1 meter in the areas other than metropolitan cities. So it is about the metropolitan cities, but in areas other than metropolitan cities with population less than 0.5 million, the minimum size of the plot of such housings should be 40 square meter with a plot frontage of minimum 4.8 meter. In dense inner city areas of metropolitan cities with population more than 1.5 million, the government may decide to have a minimum plot size of 25 square meter with a minimum frontage of 4.1 meter. So there are a few alternatives here depending upon the area population, that is metropolitan inner city or general metropolitan city or out of the metropolitan cities. There are three options for different plot sizes and frontages. For site and service scheme for two-room developments, the minimum standard house with 2 rooms, kitchen, bathing facility, and water closet are expected to develop here. The minimum plot size will be 40 square meter. In areas other than metropolitan cities having a population less than 0.5 million, the minimum size of the plot shall be 60 square meter. So the frontage of minimum 4.1 meters stands also here, but the plot size varies. And now the internal roads and walkways. Pedestrian walkways, when provided as means of access, shall be at least 3 meter wide. So there is a guideline for pedestrian walkway. It has to be 3 meter wide when it is a means of access. Such walkways shall not be longer than 60 meter, nor serve more than 10 plots on each side of the path. Other internal roads shall be at least 6 meter wide to allow emergency vehicles to enter. The paved portion of such roads, if used for pedestrian movement only, should be at least 2 meter wide. So that is about the size of the plot and the connectivities. Now comes the general building requirement part. Plinth coverage. The plinth coverage for any plot of minimum standard housing shall not exceed 65% of the plot area. So that is what is generally known as ground coverage, not more than 65% of the plot area for minimum standard housing. Plots with higher net density shall have lower plinth areas and ground coverages. However, minimum standard transitional housing have some exceptions. The plinth coverage for any plot of transitional housing shall not exceed 75% of the plot area. There shall be a setback of minimum 1.5 meter on the rear side of the plot. There is no requirement for such setback on sides and front of the plot if facing an internal road. So that is the criteria for minimum standard transitional housing. This is an exception. The height limitation in such housing will vary according to typology of each development. However, maximum height for minimum standard housing for site and service scheme shall be 10 meters. Minimum standard transitional housing of cluster type development and multi-story row type development shall have a height limitation of maximum 20 meter or 6 storied. Plinth level. The minimum plinth height of the plinth shall be 300 meter from the surrounding ground level. Habitable room. All dimensions stated in this section do not include area or dimension required for partition or enclosure wall. Criteria for habitable room shall follow the basic guidelines of Part 3, Chapter 1. So it is equal to any other housing, similar to any other housing. Overcrowding. To avoid overcrowding in all habitable rooms, a minimum standard housing including transitional housing, minimum standard housing or transitional housing, a minimum air volume of 9.5 meter cube per occupant shall be allotted. To calculate such volume, no account shall be taken of any space with a height higher than 4.25 meter or less than 2.15 meter from the roof level of the room, from the floor level of the room. So there are a few exceptions for transitional housing. In a flatted development, one room dwelling units shall have multi-purpose room. Actually, the one room itself becomes a multi-purpose room here, which may include an alcove or space for cooking as specified in B.4.5. The minimum area of this room shall be 12 square meter with a minimum width of 2.5 meter. For dwellings with 2 habitable rooms, the minimum size of at least one room shall be 9.5 square meter with a minimum width of 2.5 meter. Other habitable room shall have a minimum area of 5 square meter and minimum width of 2.2 meters. One room dwelling with plan for future extension to a two-room house shall satisfy the requirement of A and B above regarding the room sizes. The first room to be built in this type of development shall have a minimum area of 9.5 square meter with a minimum width of 2.5 meter. The total area of the 2 rooms shall be minimum of 15 square meter. All habitable rooms shall have a minimum clear height of 2.75 meter. For sloped roofs, the average height shall not be less than 2.75 meter with minimum of 2 meter at the lowest side. So there are guidelines for kitchens. General guideline will follow the part 3 chapter 1. The other guidelines, there are few exceptions for minimum standard transitional housing. I'm not going to the details of them, but they basically contain 2 types of information. One is the area of the so this is the guideline for the kitchen and some exceptions for minimum standard transitional housing. There are bathroom and water closet area requirements. These are basically standards containing the area and the minimum width for each of the functionality. That's more or less similar. Balcony and corridor, there are a few guidelines for the width and minimum width requirement. For stair, all components are referred to chapter 1 part 3, and there are few important issues like water supply. Let's go through it. One water tap or hand tube well pump per dwelling unit should be provided if feasible. Each unit of public water hydrants or community hand pumps, if provided in lieu with the individual water supply, shall serve not more than 10 dwellings units and shall not be further than 15 meter from any dwelling unit served. So there is a there can be a shared water resource, but also there are few guidelines about how far they will be located to. Lighting and ventilation. Every room, bathroom and kitchen shall have windows in external wall, opening on either on a courtyard or a balcony not wider than 2.5 meter, and the exterior. The aggregate areas of the openings in the exterior wall of a habitable room or kitchen shall not be less than 12% of the floor area, and that for a non-habitable room such as bathroom, water closet and stair shall be at least 8% of the floor area. So that is all about Appendix B, and this is the end of segment 2. So let's have a break for 5 minutes and we'll be back soon. Actually, we are running behind the schedule, so let's start with the next segment, segment 3. It covers 2 appendices. One is Appendix C, the other is Appendix E. We'll start with the Appendix C, Special Requirements for Cluster Planning, containing 3 segments. the details of which we'll discuss along the path. So let's go to the detail first. This is Appendix C. It is special requirement of cluster planning for housing. They are applicable to all housing projects, public, private, cooperative agencies, whoever the developer are. There will be guidelines for minimum area and width requirement of each habitable room and non-habitable room. The construction classification of cluster housing shall be protected type. That is a vital information here. So there is a guideline about construction classification. Cluster typology, it is a suitable typology to accommodate low and moderate density housing. With smaller plot size, it can also attain high density, which may happen to transitional housing. This is a general outline of a cluster housing. There are few typologies described here. Cluster can be back-to-back, closed cluster, cul-de-sac cluster. So there are few diagrams here. Explain those clusters, and there are few reference limits as well, like this one, that how long the pathway or roadway can be for such developments. Plot size. In an integrated cluster planning, the minimum plot size shall comply with the guidelines of Appendix B. So it refers to Appendix B. Community facilities shall be provided with the requirement of neighborhood and community facilities. All housing shall be provided with this. In such cases, the authority may allow FAR of 2 with 100% ground coverages, provided that the basic natural lighting and ventilation criteria is met through the two exterior sites, both having exposure to the adjacent neighborhood spaces. Group housing may be permitted in the form of cluster housing. However, dwelling units with plinth areas up to 20 square meter should have scope for adding habitable rooms. Group housing in a cluster should not be more than 15 meter in height. So there is a height limit. Size of cluster, single to two stories, not more than 20 houses in this kind of development should be grouped in a cluster. That is the basic module of a cluster that is suggested here. Cluster with more dwelling units may create problem relating to identity, encroachment, and maintenance. So this is the primary reference for the size of the cluster. Size of the cluster open space, minimum dimension of width shall not be less than 6 meter or 3/4 of the height of the building, whatever is higher. The area shall not be less than 36 square meter. Group housing around a cluster open space should not be more than 15 meter in height. Setbacks, the cluster type development, at least there should at least two sides of each individual dwelling shall have exterior walls and openings. No setback is required in other two sides for such development. However, for compliance of natural lighting and ventilation with this code, light well and ventilation well may be used within the cluster plot. Right to build in sky, pedestrian paths and vehicular access roads to clusters separating two adjacent clusters may be breezed. So there is an option to build on the above the roads or pedestrian paths While bridging the pedestrian, a minimum clearance should be 1 story height. The vertical clearance will be 5 meter. Vehicular access, the right of way will be 6 meter width and the vertical clearance height will be 5 meter. Pedestrian paths minimum width will be 3 meters. Width between two clusters, built area of dwelling unit within cluster shall have no setbacks from the path or road, and the pathway will be minimum 3 meter and the vehicular road will be minimum 6 meter wide. Density, transitional housing shall result in higher densities with low-rise structures. For a minimum standard housing with 1 habitable room, 1 kitchen, 1 2-fixture toilet, the required enclosure walls, as per provision of this code, a minimum dwelling unit of 23.8 square meter is required for a cluster type. However, in transitional housing, the size of the dwelling may be reduced up to 18.5 square meter. So there is a density guideline in Appendix B that must be followed also. Group toilet for transitional housing. So there is a provision of group toilets. Transitional housing may have group toilets at the rate of 1 water closet, 1 bath, and washing place, and a washing place in 3 separate chambers. This is important because they cannot be located in one single chamber or 2 chambers. There must be 3 separate facilities per 3 families. This shall not be community toilets. There is another criteria. Although they are shared, but they are not community toilets. They are shared for the 3 families only. As keys to these toilets shall only be with these 3 families, making them solely responsible for the maintenance and upkeeps of these toilets. So the service infrastructure can be shared, but it has certain guidelines or criteria to meet. Other requirements, the other requirements of the building will be governed by the other codes of this, the part and chapters of this code, and by good practice. So this segment, sorry, not the third segment, the Appendix C, and we have the final Appendix E to cover. So let's go for Appendix E directly, since we have a very shortage of time. So this is Appendix E. Generally, the Appendix E has 4 sections, and the details of which are like this, and the references are like this. So let's go for the appendix in detail. So it is about building types, development rights, and building abutting property lines. These guidelines cover the planning and general building requirements of different building types, such as attached type, detached type, semi-detached type, etc. Regarding the development rights and right regarding building on abutting property lines. So this is the general orientation. Definition and typologies. There are few types here, row type of building, semi-detached building, detached building. We can go through the diagrams and have an idea quickly. Row type has walls abutting the property line and 2 sides open within the plot with maintaining the setbacks. Let us go to the definition. A row type building abuts 2 side plot party lines and is one of a row of buildings on adjoining lots. So it is not a single independent development, it is a development of a series building activity. The end buildings of a row of attached buildings are considered semi-detached buildings if they each have minimum side setbacks. So at the end of the row, how it will end has a clue here. Here the rest two sides of the building are surrounded by yards or open spaces within the plot conforming to minimum setback requirements. Semi-detached building. A semi-detached building is a building that abuts one side of the property line of a plot and does not abut any other building or on any other side of any adjoining plots. Here the rest three non-abutting sides of the buildings are surrounded by yards and open areas within the plot conforming at least to minimum setback requirements. So it can give it can be of two types. One is not abutting neighboring building, so they all are independent, and this is also a valid option, and that they can even share one wall. So this can create two types of opportunities. For a detached building is a freestanding building that doesn't abut any other building. All sides of the buildings are surrounded by yards or open spaces conforming at least to the minimum setback requirement. So this is the detached building. Some special provisions are there for constructing walls abutting party line, because when two owners build on the same property line, there are situations that has to be addressed. So walls abutting any party line shall have no opening, shall not contain any concealed lines like water, gas, sanitary, electricity, shall be so constructed that it remains moisture free, leak proof, conforms to the fire safety requirement. A party wall shall conform with structural guidelines for earthquake and pounding gaps as referred in part 6. When designed separately, pounding gaps are mandatory. When designed and built in an integrated way in the same project, no such gap is required. Party walls can be shared or independent. So if there is a shared party wall, a party wall, if formally in written form agreed upon between two adjoining owners, may become a shared wall between the two properties built half on the land of each of the two owners, or in such other position as may be agreed upon by the two owners, with both having equal rights to use of that wall. In such cases, the structural guidelines of the code shall be abided by both parties to allow further modifications and on either side of the party wall. Independent party wall. For all other cases, the owner who intends to build the party wall shall make it wholly on his own land abutting the party line. In such cases, one or two walls abutting party line shall have bounding gaps as per structural requirements of part 6. Non-crossing of party or property line. Under all circumstances, above ground or underground, no component can cross the party line or plot demarcation line. Foundation of party wall. For foundation work, the safety of the buildings on adjoining land must be ensured because it is built on the party line. So the adjacent building or the land must be secured. The building owner who intends to erect wall abutting the side party line, if necessary, shall at his own expense underpin or otherwise strengthen or safeguard the foundations of the buildings or structures of the adjoining property. Structural independence. Building with party wall on adjacent plots must be structurally independent. Depending upon the plot frontage and the choice of structural system, a party wall may also be non-structural or non-load bearing. Where party wall or any part of it is structural, the footing foundation provisions must comply with Part 6. Utility lines and drainages, underground and surface lines. For all underground concealed pipelines, drain ducts, etc., the outer edge of such utility pipes, lines, drains, ducts shall be at least 900 meter inside from the party line. For all such lines, any surface drain or inspection pit shall be at least 250 millimeter inside from the party line. Vertical utility lines and drainages. Vertical utility lines, ducts shall not cross the party line. No pipe, gutters, spouts, surface holes, or any other type of drainages. Outlets to the adjoining property can be given. Special measures shall be taken to contain all drainages within the site. Prevention of leakage. Any leakage to neighboring property must be prevented. For such leakages, the landowner who owns such utility lines shall be responsible to repair and compensate for any damage thereby. For two adjacent walls abutting in the same property line, the gap in between must be properly sealed. Other requirements. All other requirements will be governed by the provision of this code and good practice. Measures must be taken for prevention of infiltration of rain, dust and moisture through joineries of party walls. Damp proofing and termite proofing treatment will also be there as per provision of Part 6. Chemical treatment to prevent long-term growth of fungi and other microbial forms are recommended on such walls. So that is the end of Appendix E, and actually that is also the end of our presentation today. Thank you. I have taken a few more minutes. Thank you for your patience. Let's open up with our question and answer session. I am closing the screen share so that I can look at the question answers. Thank you. Well, there is not much questions here. Someone has written that if I can explain in Bengali, she cannot understand clearly. If you can mention that which segment you are referring to, I can explain in Bengali, of course. Courses are sometimes very boring actually, and okay. Please refer A33. Maximum 175 units per hectare. Here you mean units as a flat or building. If building, of how many story? Unit is referring to per independent dwelling, so it will indicate to flat. And the story will be governed by the local authorities guideline, planning guidelines. So 175 units per hectare is 175 families per hectare. Actually, I doubt it. However, however, there is another question: shouldn't the plinth be 450 millimeter? Well, there are references in different part of this code about the plinth. Yes, there are few references about 450 millimeter, but as you know that these are general guidelines for minimum standard housing for a particular locality. If there is no additional guideline of the local authority, say for example in a hilly region where the surface runoff is higher, maybe the requirement for the plinth is much more plinth height, or it may be it may need it to be lifted up. So that will of course vary with situations and contexts, but generally it is allowed to 300 millimeter here. But of course it cannot go uh, less than that, but of course it can be higher as referred in other parts of BNBC. Well, there is a comment here. Does this plinth at 300 or 450 millimeter W or TGL? Will you please define GL? Uh, Actually, I find it difficult to abbreviate your. Uh, okay, with respect to ground level, will you please explain ground level with respect to road top? Yeah, um, uh, these are the provisions. One is on part 3, chapter 1. There it is mentioned that the 450 millimeter plinth level is required in reference to the uh, uh, adjacent road top. But here in this appendix, it is 300 millimeter from the ground level. There are few discrepancies in between these two informations, but it is up to the designer who will actually go there and comply with the most stringent rule applied to that site. So it may vary actually. That is one thing. For B442, the minimum air volume is 9.5 meter cube. Is it up to ceiling or up to below false ceiling? Actually, uh, uh, both situations are covered. As you can see that there are two heights mentioned, that the ceiling height, if it goes above certain height, cannot be calculated in this air volume. And if the ceiling height is below a certain height, that is below false ceiling level, a certain height is given there, they can also not be calculated in the air volume. So there is a range in between that can be taken for the height measurement. May we have your presented file? Well, the files are there. I think we can share it again. Want to know about cluster building? Please brief shortly. Well, cluster type has a separate appendix to explain itself. Uh, it is a development suggested for a low to medium density and can achieve high density as well. The plot size can be reduced for minimum standard transitional housing. For cluster type development, there are few subtypologies. You can go through the diagrams and you can have an idea for that. For a cluster type development, there are provisions for bridging over the pedestrian or vehicular roads, and the clearance must be 5 meters. The access of way should be 6 meter for motorable ways, and where it is pedestrian only, then it should be 3 meter at least. So these are the general outline of a cluster type building, and in a cluster type development, at least two sides will remain open, and it will conform to the it will be responsible for ventilation and lighting criterias of units, and it shall conform to the general standard of ventilation and lighting criteria. Light wells and ventilation wells may also be devised there. These are the basic guidelines. For plinth level, where there is not possible to figure ground level, or where there is road around the plot, what will be the reference of measure of height? I'm not very clear about the question, but actually ground level is always in any survey we can identify the altitudes, relative altitudes of different levels, so different elevations, and so ground level, road level can be identified, and as the plinth level height is important in our context to prevent say flooding or flash flooding or other protections. So we will apply our best judgment for that, and the safest measures should be taken. So in a situation like that, where you have maybe a few alternatives, you will go for the most stringent option that will ensure the safety of the property and the life safety of your users. Yeah, probably titled as 2020 BNBC gadget. Okay, so it was a segment of it. Okay. So there is another question. Can you please explain briefly transitional housing again? Okay. Transitional housing are built on special purpose, and it is built for a transitional purpose only. It doesn't comply with all requirements for a minimum standard housing or minimum standard community housing. So there are some exemptions for transitional housing for room sizes, or for the minimum plot size, or for some community facilities. So there are some exemptions there, and it is expected that in a situation where serious housing crisis is there and you cannot accommodate all the people in a minimum standard housing, you can opt for transitional housing, keep some people there, and it must ensure the safety, health, and sanitation facilities for the people, the basic three components, for a time being. And then on a suitable situation, you can send them to minimum standard housing. But this particular typology is the implementing and designing and implementing authority will be the government agencies. It cannot be done by any private development. So it has to be a government initiative to make this transitional housing. This is the basic of a transitional housing. Thanks a lot to you as well.